I think जूलियन को भी आपको co-host वो share करने के लिए. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll just wait for a minute and then we'll start the webinar.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, Julian.
Right. Well, thanks, Maitrayee, for agreeing to speak with us today.
Thanks for inviting. Thank you.
The idea came, I was talking to a colleague of mine here in Lyon. He's a sociologist, Massimo Eroldi. I don't know if you know Massimo.
Yeah, he's a friend. Yeah, I know him well.
Right. And he talked about your research, and so I thought this would be a good forum to talk about it, and an opportunity to get to know you even virtually.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know like this kind of initiative is there. It's great. So I'm really looking forward to also knowing you all virtually and hear more about the center, lab, etc. Yeah, quite excited.
Right, and I guess Rupali and Adishri, you guys have a little introduction on the lab. You're going to start with that, right? Or
Yeah, so I think we can start the webinar now. So I'll just first introduce the lab and then we'll start with Dr. Maitrayee's session. Yes. Yeah, so welcome everybody. A very good evening to people joining us from India, and a good morning and good afternoon to people joining us from other parts of the world. So today we are going to have an interesting webinar with Dr. Maitrayee Deka on the media assemblages of Bazaar branch. So before we start the webinar, I thought of just quickly introducing you to our lab and our team here. So the Consumer Culture Lab is an initiative at IIM Udaipur. And this lab was actually started around a year back. And the motive of this lab is actually to seek to work towards generating thought leadership on Indian consumer culture. So there's actually not much research, academic research done yet in the space of Indian consumer culture within India. So this lab is actually like a one-of-a-kind unique initiative. And basically we are trying to bring in multidisciplinary perspectives from anthropology, sociology, as well as psychology to understand Indian consumers. And Indian consumer is not like just one monolith, like there are various different voices that India has and Indian consumers have. So through this lab, we are actually trying to work on multiple research projects to understand different facets of Indian consumers. And not just like doing research alone, but also because we're in the space of education, we also want to use this lab as a platform to create and disseminate knowledge on qualitative research methods, targeting both academic and non-academic industry practitioners within India. So that is like the larger goal of our lab. It's basically like a hub for people interested in consumer culture in India to actually come together and collaborate and engage. So this webinar is like one of the various initiatives that this lab has been doing over the last year. And this is our team, like the people who are involved in the lab. So Professor Julian Kela, he is actually the founder of this lab and he's our research advisor. And he's an associate professor of marketing at the Nanyang Business School. And then myself, I'm Professor Tanvi Gupta. I'm an assistant professor here at IIM Udaipur. And Professor Rajesh Nanarpuza, he's an associate professor at IIMU. And both of us are the faculty working at this lab. And we are pretty much working as mentors for the research team that is working at this lab. And this is like the core research team at our lab, which is Rupali Kapoor and Adishri Guha. And they both are come with a lot of hands-on experience in the space of anthropology and sociology. So Rupali Kapoor is a research officer at our lab, and she's trained in social and cultural anthropology from UCL London, and she holds a master's in sociology. And Adishri is a senior research executive at our lab, and she holds a master's degree in criminology and justice from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And both of them actually have worked in the commercial market research space in India, and they have come with a lot of experience in doing hands-on qualitative research in the Indian market. And we at our lab, actually, we have been working on a lot of interesting projects. So this is one of the current ongoing major project that our lab is working on, which is called the Exploring the Digital Heartland of India. So basically, this project is looking at how consumption of digital technology has impacted people's lives in India. But we are going beyond the regular metros that usually gets captured in research in India. So basically, consumer research in India is centered on the three metros, like, you have Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai. So there are just stories coming from these metros. But then there's a lot of rich insights which can be gathered from tier 1 and tier 2, tier 3 cities, the small towns in India. And small towns in India have actually kind of leapfrogged much ahead of the metros in terms of the adoption of digital technology. So we have an ongoing project right now where we are actually trying to use digital anthropology and digital ethnography methods to connect with consumers in small towns in India to understand how their narratives of digital consumption is unfolding, and how the interaction of consumers with digital technology is actually impacting the way they relate to spaces, objects, and humans around them, and also their own identity. But this is like an ongoing project which we are really excited about. And as in I request all of you to watch this space. In 2022, we are planning to come up with results of this study. So please watch out for more updates from our lab. Yeah, so this was like just a brief snapshot of our lab. So now, without much ado, I would like to just start the webinar. So I'd like to request Professor Julian to just introduce our speaker for today.
All right, I'm not sure I'm the best person to introduce Maitrayee, because this is the first time we meet, but Maitrayee, I know does a lot of interesting work in sociology and at the intersection of sociology and anthropology to look at consumer culture in India, and has worked with, done a PhD in Milan with the team there, including Adam Arvidsson, and has published a fair amount on the topic of brands in the informal economy in India. And I guess we wanted to bring like a new perspective on branding. I mean, we, the lab is hosted by a business school, but brands are so ubiquitous in contemporary culture that I think it's this is an object that is worthy of investigation from different kinds of disciplines, including sociology. And I guess we're especially interested in looking at, how does sociology engage with brands? And I know that Maitrayee has also done a fair amount of digital ethnographic work. So, maybe she can speak to that topic. But, thanks a lot, Maitrayee, for accepting our invitation. And I really look forward to see, how you engage with the topic of brands in the informal economy.
Hey, great. Thank you so much. I'll just start with sharing my screen. And so as I was just saying, it's really fascinating work you're doing there and very topical. So I will be really excited and hopefully, hear more about and see what's going to be coming up in your lab. Thank you, Tanvi and Julian, for the introduction and also some information on the lab. I'm going to speak about media assemblages of Bazaar brands. Before I start that, this one, so I have to give this disclaimer. I'm a STS scholar, but I don't know how to work technology, so maybe this should go. But anyways, so I study mainly three electronic marketplaces in Delhi. I've been studying Palika Bazaar, Nehru Place, and Lajpat Rai Market from 2012 onwards, first as part of my PhD research. And essentially, I am interested in looking at the informal marketplaces, which I use the word bazaar specifically to somehow conceptualize this kind of economy, if at all it is possible to speak about them as a category. more so because I'm interested in somehow delineating bazaars from capitalism, and that's been the larger theoretical project, and it's also developing now into a monograph, and I'm finishing off its last stages, which kind of projects informal marketplaces as a sociological and analytical category, if not completely distinct, but has its own characteristics, which is not essentially accumulative as much as we see capitalist, places or capitalist kind of infrastructure projecting profit for profit's sake. So my study essentially is about traders and vendors of video games. In Palika Bazaar and Maitrayee market, I essentially looked at small scale traders who were mostly, the popular term would be shopkeepers, I guess, who sell games in these marketplaces. But in Nehru Place, I also looked at the street vendors who sell CDs and pirated DVDs of games. But while I was, doing this kind of ethnography, one thing also came up is the consumption patterns of these people. And that was something which, even though wasn't earlier my focus, but this was, marketplaces for various reasons are such a microcosm. You get to see not only one side, but it is essentially about all of the economics of it, distribution, consumption, and production also to an extent. So that was gradually also another thread that I kind of developed over time. First, between 2012 and 13, I already started talking to, garment vendors outside Palika, for instance, if any one of you know Delhi or been there, or also in other small popular marketplaces like Kamlanagar. But essentially, I think what I found very interesting is the Gandhinagar market. And today's presentation, the insights are going to be more coming from that marketplace. So Gandhinagar is seen as Asia's largest garment market. I have not done fact checking, so I don't know if that's true or not, but it is a very big informal marketplace. And I keep using the term informal, and I just want to say it's because a lot of the transactions are not billed, it's gray transaction. And also I take the definition of urban informal economy as places which do not employ more than 10 workers or employees. So given these two considerations and the legal lack of legal safety network, etc., I still use the term informal, and I'll be using it interchangeably with bazaar and also markets. So it has about 1,000 wholesale traders, but it's also a place whereby within the radius of 2 kilometers, you have a lot of this kind of shop, production unit, factory, like within the shop, you have different people who are using sewing machine to create either jeans or t-shirts. So it functions both as a retail wholesale, but also in some kind of production system. How do one of the things of studying this kind of marketplace, you are essentially also studying its special, the space of it, right? Because it is not that everywhere we have similar type of growth of, there are always specificities. And in fact, Delhi is probably over-researched, and I'm glad the CCL would be looking at extending research outside of the metros, and it is very essential. Something I think will be very important in the coming times. But I will again be speaking from Delhi today. One of the things that's been fascinating of a city like Delhi is that it is, so dynamic. All cities are dynamic spaces, no doubt, because they are always attracting diverse group of people, students, immigrants, refugees, in Delhi's case, especially because of the historical changes, Mughal or even before, local rulers to colonial and now to post-colonial times, that there is now a really rich literature. And I'm glad that for someone wanting to study a place like Delhi, I can already piggyback on so much of literature and really nuanced literature coming in this area. I'm just mentioning here Dia Mehra and Sanjay Srivastav's work, especially Dia Mehra's work, where she essentially looks the city space as being, I mean, she's not the first, but she does enhances this outlook of looking at Delhi as somehow being, or contemporary Delhi as being impacted by changes that had come, you know, from colonial interventions, like coming up of the Delhi Improvement Trust in 1936 and so forth, also establishment of Delhi Municipal Committee and NDMC, to somehow already have a structure of Delhi between elite and chaotic spaces. But what is interesting in Mehra's work is that she already kind of shows that this is not an absolute process of top-down intervention. You always have a lot of randomness and also messiness when actually you try to implement these kind of top-down initiatives. So she, in her work, for instance, Second World War and partition emerges as two of this contingency that a lot of these early planners had to also incorporate, you know, or they encountered this kind of massive influx of people. So how, even if on paper there was this idea of mapping Delhi into segregated spaces, when they were actually doing it, they were having to encounter a lot of these contingencies and global events. Srivastav's work also look at this, you know, this kind of interaction between, and it's much more anthropological interaction between plants and also ordinary lives. Having said that, I think one thing for sure that Delhi has been witnessing, and especially in the last decade or so, especially after the 2010 Commonwealth Games, is this kind of presence of elite infrastructure, you know. Or rather the vision of the city as coming from an elite lens. And Amita Vaviskar's work in this area is quite fascinating. She's written a lot on bourgeois environmentalism. And her argument, and I'm generalizing here, is to talk about, you know, how a certain kind of elite, especially new middle class, you know, through resident welfare association, try to impact and impinge on schemes and like plans, like master plan for Delhi, for instance. And this is done not only by their own kind of activism, but also somehow colliding with, you know, whether it is Supreme Court judges giving decisions in favor of middle class sensibilities, or the Bhagidari system, for instance, which Delhi governments kind of gives the initiative of collaboration between what essentially now turns out to be middle class inhabitants and how their vision of the city should look like. So in a way, we have to see that no matter how much the chaotic and the engagement happens, there is still a vision of the city that is coming from somewhere. And it's not a vision essentially that is for everyone. It is pushed by an elite section. It's very difficult for anybody to talk about, I think, categories. And as I think just in the beginning, Tanvi mentioned that how it is difficult to even say what Indian consumerism is about. But I guess that for, and this I find more and more important, just for saying certain specificities, we have to create categories, because otherwise we will never be able to say anything. In my case, for instance, I do use quite liberally words like popular or non-elites when, you know, it's, if you really go into what exactly that, you won't be able to find exactly all the definitions that suits what you observe in the field. But I mean, the groups of people that is part of my research is somehow the non-elites, and that is a category I think is easier to kind of show whom I'm talking about. They are not the, you know, landed gentry. They are not the bourgeois urban middle class. They are not the politicians, nor are they the business elite. So all of the people who are outside these groups are the people in some way who visits or who are part of the urban bazaars that I'll be talking about. How does my work connect to media? First of all, of course, as I said, I looked at video games, essentially, but also when I'm looking at a marketplace like Gandhinagar, I think media or the media infrastructure is very much part of the research that I do, but also what emerges from my field work. In this regard, again, I'm also very, I guess, fortunate to have a very rich scholarship on Delhi, especially Ravi Sundaram's work and the work coming out of CSTS and continues to come out of the Sarai program there, is about essentially showing that what I initially spoke about, the elite and the ordinary kind of Delhi, the elite and the messy Delhi, can also be seen through how media goods and media urbanism is experienced in the city. And Ravi Sundaram's Pirate Modernity, I personally find it a very interesting book because it's one of the first, and actually it's a happy coincidence. He does look at some of the three marketplaces that I also look at in my research, but he kind of sees it. There is also kind of a genealogy. So these marketplaces starts off with, smuggled transistors to phones to video games. So they have kind of been experimenting and working with different media products since the 1970s onwards. So there is this engagement of official or this engagement of what emerges as essentially different types of intervention is actually a lot of the times done through very experimental use of media. And in Ravi Sundaram's work, he is essentially showing that, of course, the master plan wants Delhi to be this way, and the media image of it is also this swanky, upcoming city, which is going to mirror London or New York style, places, or this is the kind of vision. But there is always been a media modernity, which is completely not just clueless, doesn't really follow this kind of sentimentality of what that aesthetics or purpose should be like. And his work talks about like the spilling over, right? Because when these marketplaces were created, they were essentially meant to be these idle consumer spaces where intellectuals met, or like the planner Jagmohan saw it as kind of a piazza, European piazza, which is a place for a lot of dialogue and deliberation. But what you get instead is, stolen electricity, pirated games, and a lot of dystopic, in a way, version of the city space. And Ravi, and also like Peter Manuel before him, kind of shows that already this is somehow ungrappled by elite actors or the official eye. This kind of media modernity has always been there, and this is the media modernity that has fed the ordinary people all around India. Think about, I am a kid of the 90s, so I remember a lot of remixes and a lot of like Gulshan Kumar's, cassettes circulating all around. These are essentially where pirated networks of popular songs being recorded by minor artists and then spreading it through very cheap and accessible cassettes. So this media infrastructure of pirated and stolen cable or electricity has been a very dynamic side of how ordinary people have engaged and also appropriated media goods. So my work essentially, when I'm studying Bazaar brands, is in a way follow-up of these networks. These networks, or that sensibility is always been there somehow to make very expensive media goods accessible, but also to, in a way, have a rogue kind of approach to available infrastructure. So it's never been a lack of let's put it, imagination or courage. And this comes from, I think, a very pragmatic approach to technology and what especially media technology allows and how it could be used. So one of the things that when I was first in Gandhinagar market, I saw was this kind of usage of, inbuilt features in computers, like, Paint, or also sometimes they had Adobe software, to use this different kind of symbols, or what they call stickers, to put in one or specific garments, or specific type of t-shirts or jeans, etc. And this they did was so something like, something, I'll just give a sticker book or something they called it, where they put all the logos together. So I am not able to produce that many images from my field work, because they were not really, I couldn't take so many pictures. So that's something I think we can also talk about. The flip side of doing ethnographies in bazaars. Honestly, I find it very difficult to take pictures, and I hardly have any. But this is something like broadly how it would look like a literal book, where they had logos after logos attached to, from side by side, and put neatly, like an album of logos, basically. And this was what I saw in 2016, when I was like speaking to about 15, 16 traders and did more like focused interviews with them. And one of the things that came up was that basically they just take logos from the internet, and they just use the Paint feature and like put it all together, and that sticker book is used as a source of inspiration. So this could be global brands, but this could also be local brands of people who wanted their garments to have a particular identity. And sometimes it could be a mix match of different logos. Something like this. So this jeans has H&M, somewhere HMN, and then Gap. Or in the other one, you could have Ferrari and some other local. So there was like this kind of explosion of logos, And I mean, one of the things that brands are known for is this kind of ability to have a narrative around them, right? So there is this almost in the extreme, a kind of identity towards them. So you have ideas about brand community, brand authenticity, and this is it's just about the logo. We are willing to pay hundreds of dollars to buy a bag or a piece of technology. So what happens when you have this kind of complete irreverence or indifference to the logos? The more than the idea of actually attaching to that narrative, it is idea, what they said was, as the article with Adam also we spoke about, is names doing rounds. So it was all about iska naam aajkal bahut chal raha hai, or you do hear a lot about them. And what does that essentially say to us, which I think as an ethnographer I thought is that, and this is by juxtaposing the different things that I was observing, was I don't have images, but like sometimes like having Apple logo on a t-shirt or Facebook, and that's when they said iska naam. And I was quite fascinated by that they think that these are the things which everybody is talking about and is somehow significant, but not essentially also relating to them in the same logic as how a user would essentially be thinking about them. So definitely there is this appropriation happening here, and both the level of breaking the stereotype of what brands should do and the value regime that just an insignia could produce. You're breaking that by appropriating that, but also somehow being part of the contemporary, because if they somehow do not, I think just by naming them, they are also in a way evoking the particular context in which we all are living today in global modernity. So this was what I observed in 2016, and then I also did some field work in 2019, just before the pandemic hit us. And that time I also, I mean, it's not like this kind of sticker book disappears, but what also comes up is already when I am entering the market, the traders are scrolling a lot. And I'm always someone who I mean, I got on WhatsApp also through my traders, to my trader friends in Palika, because I'm a little bit slow. And also the time I'm there in 2019, like they're scrolling and they're asking me to see, you know, their Vigo video, and something I didn't know before. I was like, okay, that's very fascinating. So something which they were already quite good at was to use up their time by just scrolling. You know, they were talking to me, but always on the phone. And sometimes I was very lucky that they pulled me and showed what they were searching. And that gave this another angle to what's now happening in terms of inspiration and innovation in this kind of understanding of bazaar brands in a marketplace like Gandhinagar market. Already, I think, and I think journalists are very good at that. I don't know if Nayan Jyoti wants to call himself a journalist, call them themselves a journalist, but this is a really interesting video essay that Nayan Jyoti did on TikTok in India, and they just use a lot of videos from across different towns and villages in India, showing how working class, or they use the term working class to talk about how you know, this kind of different logic to what is entertainment and different logic to what is essentially interesting or even aesthetically appealing. You know, so many times I think outside of that context, people would think cringe-worthy. And this is a thing that I think a lot of the time when TikTok first came into being a feature, now of course it's banned, but when it initially started to become a feature of Indian social life, colleagues and people almost said how cringe-worthy this is, and cringe became a word to talk about what kind of thing is happening on this platform. You know, why are they dancing or whatever, this mimicking of dialogues, etc. But I think more and more people are starting to note that this is essentially something which is seems devoid of logic, only understood from a point of view of, you know, fruitful use of time, and what is wasteful and what is essentially productive at the end of the day. But if you do not have that lens and you look at it from completely different perspective, this is for the first time you see a kind of liberating space for people to engage with an aesthetics and create for themselves through videos and images a space that is not being governed by any sensibility other than their own. So that's why I think TikTok, or now also other like Vico videos and other instant messaging, social networking are interesting places to see popular and working class desires and practices. So this is like the place where I am at when I'm looking at this marketplace in 2019. First, they're scrolling on their phones, and then also to have apps like TikTok where they can go and see what's going on and what's trending, you know, real-time kind of understanding of different stimulus that's coming to them at different points in time. And in fact, like almost immediately, they also switched on, like it has happened a few times, especially with the t-shirt Apna Time Aayega, which I also write in the paper, because that's a movie that did from Gully Boy, you know, which became quite popular, the song. And I think I don't know how much of the context was important to them, but just the idea of seizing that moment, you know, that kind of slogan really caught on in 2019, and almost many people, you know, everywhere I saw wearing that t-shirt, but in the bazaars, there were like tons of them. And this person, he was on this kind of video, and then he switched on to one of the apps, India Mart and also Uran, and he starts to scroll different B2B commerce websites to then also make like look through and see the prototypes that could be either copied and produced in the marketplace. Also, sometimes they ordered things from there and then sold it in the mass marketplace. So it was this possibility to somehow, connect these symbols that are, or this kind of sensory stimulus on their phone, connect it immediately to e-commerce and B2B e-commerce sites, and somehow bring it to the marketplaces as experienceable commodities in a matter of a few weeks, was something that was very fascinating. And I think, if not novel, it is a slight addition to what they were doing. So bazaars have always been good with this kind of invisible or unofficial channels of bringing together different infrastructure, also create in the process. And as a researcher, I am not at all romantic about this prospect. And I think most anthropologists are not, or because when you are actually researching, it's nothing about them is like, so to speak, TED Talk worthy, that they are somehow saying, oh, we are great innovators and we do this and it comes to us. It's a very pragmatic approach to things. And I think that's which sometimes for a lot of us is difficult to understand. I'm also quite fascinated, like, with my phone or something. I don't want it to break because it will cause some, that kind of reservation isn't there. It's a different type of just using the most of what's in front of you and solve the problem, because there are other priorities to be met. So that comes from their essentially the precarious situation that they find time and again. And also, although, like, traders are, and sometimes traders are also seeing the problematic side of certain kind of movements and populism, but I think they are still quite persecuted when it comes to, adopting to large-scale changes and persecution because of eviction and so also right now the increasing amount of e-commerce, platform economy and its impact on face-to-face commerce. So that's what, so it comes from scrolling on their phone to, going to B2B and then having a t-shirt like this, So this is the type of, one of the ways. I'm not saying every time this is the way it happens, but just to give sense. And then you have a TikTok t-shirt somehow being in Gandhinagar market. And this kind of innovation system is essentially, again, to talk about, is about understanding excess in some way. There is a lot of, the idea of the excess is something that keeps coming, and already anthropologists like Konstantin Nakasis's work, which looks at similar marketplaces but in South India, and he talks about how counterfeits and this kind of different type of knockoffs are essentially a way to gaze at meaning making, which is outside of how capitalist brands think them to be. So when a brand like a Nike or Columbia or some high street brands, essentially they are never able to fathom what meaning making can happen in ordinary consumption when they are slightly modified. In his case, he talks a lot about doing style or copying the stylistic variations of a superstar like Rajnikant, or understanding how a jeans or a t-shirt should look, is essentially coming from the user's ordinary ways of adapting to global goods. So he uses the idea of excess as surfeit, and it's an immaterial excess of social meaning making that emerges out of engagement with branded goods, original or otherwise, but cannot be fully reduced to the brand concept, not at least not as formulated by marketing discourse or intellectual property laws. Appropriation, resignation, parodies, idiosyncratic association, indifference, and ignorances. And this is also what we have been seeing, right? That when there is no real logic to why something is put in here other than what they in that very specific moment, maybe out of randomness, out of some kind of, you know, a spark of inspiration, put these things together. But I think Nakassis sees this as, to the outsider, you know, this in itself is very subversive, because if you have the other literature on brands and how it's all about authenticity, identity, as I mentioned, and this kind of almost full-fledged idea of what, if not full-fledged, but you know, you have this association with the meaning making, which kind of goes, of course, it's not like just one, there's a lot of influences comes when one is using something like an Apple product or something. But I think just this breakaway, and that the official narratives cannot gaze at this extensive meaning making that happens, is interesting, no doubt. It's just fascinating, and that's why I think he is a great scholar to understand how intellectual property, especially in terms of trademark, is a narrow vision to talk about what does counterfeit violate, or what does it essentially threaten. A lot of this, of course, comes from the French philosopher Bataille, in looking at initially as when you have something in excess, it's always something which is not always seen as productive, but wasteful. And that has always been a logic to kind of put capitalist calculation into check, you know, because when it is about money, we are always very calculative of what is going where, what is wasteful, what is useful, what can be saved, what can, you know, so there is a logic of not being wasteful. And for someone like Bataille, it was always about seeing this expenditure, which is not going into any kind of productive or any kind of accumulative logic, is quite fascinating. And I think this, both for Nakassis's work and Bataille, the idea of excess is essentially subversive enough to be seen as a category worth exploring, you know, what's happening in these bazaars. Okay, I already spoke a lot, but I will just now kind of talk about like how do the traders or the vendors themselves look at this excess, you know. One of the things that came up is that even though there is an excess, you know, as I'm talking about in terms of using different logos or kind of this guerrilla strategy of going into like e-commerce, video apps, and kind of accumulating or collapsing these different universes, is still there's an aesthetic judgment. You know, traders told me that the customers they get are so much about getting so many things together, like get zippers here, get you know, different logos or different stickers in the jeans, then they want different kind of other accessories attached to the jeans. And one thing they said, that there is still an aesthetic judgment that these traders make. And one thing they said that they don't want to kind of compromise is that they won't have zipper in a, like, won't make an, put an elastic in a jeans, you know, because there were also some consumers who wanted, why don't you put some elastic on the waistline? And they were like, no, that's not a jeans, you know, that's a jogger. So we are not going to do that. So even though it's an universe whereby you feel like everything is just like randomly put together, the traders do sometimes have this aesthetic call, you know, sometimes some things are just too much. So that's definitely there. And that's probably product by product specific and what kind of discretion they use. But other is also, you know, time pass and idling. So this kind of experimenting with excess or creation of excess is not essentially all about being these cool creators. There is a lot of moments of dull moments, moments of time pass and not doing anything. And that's also, where we kind of come back to the whole idea of why this space is still not, it's not an elite kind of production loop, but this is a space where sometimes this overcompensation also happens because they are probably not the key stakeholders in an urban space. So in a way, a lot of the time I find like why they are having to bring together this whole different body of stimulus and symbols is to somehow overcompensate on how they feel and how they feel alienated from a certain discourse of the city, but also the symbolisms around them. And another way is to also see the makeup of this marketplace. At the end of the day, the bazaars are commercial places, and despite it appearing and providing this kind of innovative networks, at the end of the day, it is about selling the products that they sell. And if they lay unsold, it's never going to give them a sense of purpose or the excitement that as an ethnographer you see when this kind of appropriation happens at the ground level. I think I'll stop here and hear more from what others say, and then hopefully we can bring things up in the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Maitrayee. All right, let's see if we have any questions. Yeah, maybe I'll start with the question. I was just curious. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I was just curious about the relationship between the traders and consumers. I think I remember in your article that basically the traders tend to see their consumers as irrational. I was just curious about that, in terms of like how they make sense of their consumers, how they talk about their consumers, and what kind of experiences nourish that understanding. Like what's the how do we imagine their market in a sense?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, yeah, it's interesting to see, because sometimes you feel at one level there is a kind of a shared universe between the consumers and traders, and that always comes back through ideas around scarcity of money, for instance. So both type of both categories feel that they are working with the money crunch. And I think a lot of the idiosyncrasies emerges within that fold. That I found it quite amusing, I mean, both are complaining about essentially the same thing. The traders are unhappy or disappointed that the consumers are not essentially the most educated ones who wants to buy like brand new products. And the consumers are essentially not happy with getting what they want for the best price possible. But within that economic constraint, of course, emerges this kind of annoyance when you're not able to actually kind of see what this product means to be. And somehow I feel the traders often feel they have a more of a sensibility that is closer to what these goods are supposed to do than their consumers come up with. But
right.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And you also talked about like the difficulties of taking pictures in your field work. I was just curious about that, like how how do you explain those complexities?
Yeah, that's, I think, something I also personally struggle with. I see a lot of the people also coming up. I mean, I do have few pictures, but for me, it's very difficult, maybe because of my gender also. I mean, I stand out anyways in very, masculine spaces as a woman. But other than that, I think for me, the ethics of ethnography is very important. If someone says, no, I do not probe, I do not try to be slimy and take that. And I guess like, especially for these marketplaces, when there are raids and other kinds of persecution happening quite frequently, they just sometimes think I'm a journalist or a spy or someone, masquerading as a researcher. So it's happened. I've always tried, to get to record or click pictures, but immediately when I do that, I see a complete change, and they are quite, distrustful with this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one more question, but maybe we can see if someone else has a question. Maybe.
Julian, I just had a question. So Maitrayee, this is Rajesh. So one of the things that you talked about in this is about this time pass and idle, times, right? So I just wanted to understand from a fieldwork perspective, were there, certain times where you thought it was more conducive to talk to these people? So was it like seasonally? Was it sometimes in the day? So I just wanted it would be helpful to get some perspective in terms of how you navigated, talking, getting interviews and so on at different times of the day, or maybe at different times of the year.
Yeah, that's again a good question. I think like it is a very challenging, I would also want to hear from you, but personally, I find it very challenging to do research in marketplaces. And that's why also I think it's under research, because one of the place where you feel you're most unwanted is there. It's not that they are really there to chat. It's not their living room. It's their place of business for survival. So all the time they feel. So one is like my presence creating that kind of annoyance or disappointment that I'm not there to buy things always. But at another level, I think this anxiety of precarity is real. I don't want to sound like doing a psychological profiling of the vendors, but I do feel whenever I've been there, it's this tensed atmosphere at not able to be successful in transactions. So that's a vibe is ever present, but at some moment more than others. I think when there is good business, it's more levity. When there's nothing, there's more like a strain. So you see a difference in that. But yeah, so you have to be a leech and kind of, yeah.
And just to follow up, so does that change over time? Right, ethnography is also about prolonged engagement. So, did you see their demeanor towards you changing since they kept seeing you? Maybe they thought you're harmless over a period of time. So, did you notice that, and how? Like, some perspective would be very helpful.
Over time, I think what changed is that I also kind of molded to traders who were more willing to talk to me. So I was, of course, the ones who got most annoyed. They would even not entertain me. So those kind of fell out. But even those who became like friends, they didn't always want to talk about the things that I wanted to talk about. So, it's the typical, I think it's a very Indian, South Asian thing that we start to become more familiar. So it's always about like other things that they want to chat. So it's a challenge, but yeah, that's the, otherwise, I guess one of the things we can say that as social scientists is that that's the struggle that we go through, yeah.
Right. There was one question in the, I don't know if you can see the question in the chat. I guess maybe it's from someone who's coming more from the commercial side, asking, is there any learning that brands can adopt to attract retaining consumers from these markets selling unofficial products? So in other words, is there anything of interest here for someone who's working for a brand?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I can give the right answer to that question, but one thing I think I find is kind of lacking to an extent is this streamlining, but this is not just true for India, everywhere. I think we assume too much about our consumer, which essentially is not true. You know, all our assumptions come from people like us most of the time, who are fixated almost with, you know, in certain kind of aesthetic, certain kind of meaning making. But if we really go even a little bit outside of like that 90% of population, their understanding, whether it's of kitsch or this kind of juxtaposition, I guess that could be an interesting thing to take. That lot are exciting for many people than we think. This kind of more fanciful aesthetics that we think are always exciting to people.
Right. I mean, I guess like for me, like one thing that stands out in your work and Nakase's ethnography of stylists in South India is that, you know, maybe the way that we think about brands in kind of, you know, you could say textbooks or, you know, especially like Western centric type of knowledge about brands, you know, doesn't necessarily fit kind of like your findings in a sense, right? I mean, that brands exist in other ways, you know, in this part of, you know, particular kinds of settings. That's the way I see it, at least, right?
Yeah.
And I was just curious, like comparing, since you did work in North India, I mean Delhi, if we can call it North India, and since it was about the same time that Nakasi did his ethnography in Maitrayee or Chennai, if I remember.
Tamil Nadu, yeah.
Tamil Nadu, yeah. I wonder if you saw any differences. You know, obviously he talks about like the South Indian kind of like film industry as having a particular importance in his field work, but I was just wondering if you saw any kind of like differences between, you know, his ethnography and yours in terms of your findings.
I think, yeah, I mean, although I haven't done as extensively as he did on consumerism, but also just from what, little I have done in this area is that in South India, probably the stylistic parameters are clearer than in North India. I found like in the marketplaces that I studied, it's even more random and fast moving, because at least he could see that Rajnikant was such a prolific figure and as an inspiration for a lot of the things that was going, how they were dressing up or what they thought was stylish. But in the bazaars, they were very, very distracted. So one day it could be TikTok. Next time I go there, it's Apna time. Next time it's the Shiva t-shirts for Bole Bom. So it's even more like it's very difficult to pin down what essentially is driving them. But this is our contemporary, right? We are all living in this barrage of stimulus. I mean, for someone who's not really part of this generation of TikTokers, I find it a little bit, but from the inside, of course, it makes sense to them to kind of write this change and shifting things that they see as attractive. Yeah.
So do you feel that, like you were talking about like cassette culture in the 90s and compared to like the way that brands like operate in the bazaar, do you feel like that this kind of like acceleration of the signs has to do with the same kind of acceleration of stimuli in the digital world? Is that and if so, like, do you have any kind of, apart from seeing that there are some parallels between the two, like, do you have like ways to make those connections other than just seeing that there's the same acceleration? In other words, like, are there links between the two worlds that allow you to see that they're connected?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really didn't give so much thought to it, but you're right. I mean, there is definitely an acceleration, but I think it's always this kind of trap, right? You don't want to be so deterministic as to say that because media formatting of this short video is actually guiding everything. It's also, I think, probably a coming together of different things. I would say first, this is really a moment where, without romanticizing too much, is the time when we are seeing a lot of other kind of also people and practices and their ways of being, which was probably not as prevalent in the 90s because of social media. That's true. You know, somehow there has been a bridging of this kind of small and rural areas to the urban by this non-stop feeds. But on the other hand is also that why not? I mean, now you have this infrastructure. So essentially you would have, I mean, people are diverse and India is diverse. You know, we are probably getting into the surface of what is an Indian subjectivity. You know, it's Bollywood, it's kitsch, it's melodramatic, it's also very emotional, it's all of this. And maybe in a cassette format, not to like, it won't get as much of an exploration as it would get now in the video format. So it's coming together. So it's very exciting. I mean, I think it's, and more work has to be done to go deeper into this, but I can only speculate. Maybe these are some of the things that's happening. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, I guess like there was a question which is which could be connected to that kind of like acceleration, but a question from Piyush about whether you notice some competitive rivalry or competition among sellers, right? I mean, so like how do we how much do we compete? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, they compete all the time, and I think that is the classical also definition of markets, that they're competitive, you know, as opposed to capitalist brands, which can be sometimes monopolistic, that you break all competition. So, I mean, the way Facebook probably, or a few of the companies, Google and all, are trying to just get this big infrastructure around them is very different from how Bazaar actors work. They are essentially all competing with each other, but essentially also there is a larger ethic in this kind of universe, which it's not just me, but others have also written about that. There are ideas about how much is because of the social humiliation and status. That's also, so nobody is out there to just kind of wipe out a competitor. There is like, but there is some kind of ways in which they negotiate to have an edge, but not completely become a monopolistic trader. Yeah.
Right. And then there was one question from Encore talking about the idea of excess. So the question is like, the kind of excess that you talk about in bazaars, how is it different from all the other notions of excess documented in literature on organized markets, and what do you see as the differences?
Probably the primary is that this is an excess which is created by this anonymous and larger group of people. So it's an, I mean, excess as is probably always not within a rationality, but it's not even an organized chaos like probably in the brands would be, like even like global brands now do that. And I agree with that. Like they bring together a lot of symbolisms from the streets to high fashion and put all of it together. But I think there is still a marketing brand, a marketing strategy or some kind of people doing it. But in bazaars, it is in the making. So you see it as it is happening. There's not something that's coming from somewhere, but it's sort of emerging in the moment.
All right. I don't know if maybe Tanvi, if you have a question or.
Yeah, and I just found that image very fascinating in your slide where you had the jeans pant with the Ferrari logo and I think like a Nike logo on it. So that was something very fascinating because I think like a person wearing such a garment would not even pretend that it's an original, as if it's a counterfeit, because like multiple logos on one pant. So that got me thinking, like like it's about production and the way they're creating a mashup of different brands on the same product. That was something very interesting. And I think in the digital space also, like for example, I see my son watching YouTube videos. So they are like videos created where they have taken Peppa Pig and mashed it with Minecraft. Like different kinds of digital products are just being mashed and created by like regular people. So I think like actually getting people creating physical products which are mashups of different brands and people are actually buying it and wearing it is something very fascinating to look at, for example.
Yeah, thank you.
We just had a question follow up to what Tanvi was saying, right? So I think one of your inferences seems to be that, some of that excess comes because, these people are marginalized and they're out of the mainstream and so on. So, I just felt that, like what made you come to that conclusion? Like what were some of the things that you saw that made you come to that sort of an inference?
Okay, so I mean, there are like some of the, complementary conversations, for instance, like when they were talking about how this was not the ideal space for commerce anymore because of the changes and lesser consumers coming. And I think the platform economy really hit, and now with the pandemic probably even more so, is that there is a dwindling number of consumers to these marketplaces. The other is this kind of understanding, and it's a deeper probably dilemma, but that they are not really doing the right thing because they do see that somehow some of their action is not morally right, like piracy. So they are operating like all humans from very different registers, and there is not a clear register in which they feel entirely empowered, and in fact the register that I see as empowering is also not empowering to them, and I think this is with all anthropological work. I don't think so Nakasis's interview is essentially said we are the leaders of our destiny and we are doing something very grand, but as researchers we have to do that we take out some of the subversive aspect. And this is also very essential today, because otherwise if we don't do that we lose out completely on this phenomenon. But on the other hand, I guess as much as we can also show that this came from all these different other things that were going on. So yeah, a more like, I think, a subjective feeling of marginalization. Yeah.
Okay, there was a question from Abi Abraham. What's the meaning that the consumer makes out of these mashed brands? Yeah. I guess I mean I have a kind of like a follow-up question on that. There was work by Sarah Deka on like I think again that was in Bangalore and South India on non-elite consumers. You could say like lower middle class maybe consumers in India, and like this notion of dignity and through visibility. That in other words, at least garments, were important because they were markers of, they enable a class that is largely invisible to be visible. In other words, that for a class of people who kind of like remains in the margins of visibility, having very clean clothes or having so-called decent clothing was a way to become a decent person, right? And so like partake or be comfortable in spaces of the middle class, so malls and so on, right? And so I guess like to follow up the question on like consumers, do you feel that like this like Tanvi was saying, like having like multiple brands like on a pair of jeans, does this have anything to do with, again, like, okay, wanting to be in this case out there in terms of being visible, as opposed to being, say trendy or glamorous or just aesthetically pleasing. I mean, it's like what. So the question is like, what is the place of visibility in this kind of like mashed up versions of brands and clothing?
Yeah, that's again interesting. I think it's the latter. It's not so much about visibility or kind of acceptance. I guess it's just about aesthetically that they want everything to be there. It's about ownership as well. So it's just like, if these are all there, I want it to be in the clothes. But I mean, as much I spoke to the consumers, it was never that then I'll be seen or I'll be accepted by this, but they just thought it's nice to have as many. And that's why also I think all the things they want in that garment, somehow that's appealing to them too.
Right. So it's a kind of like appropriation of a commercial system, right? It's kind of like the brand is like okay, this is like this world that exists out there, and I make it mine, and I take as many as I can.
And also not care what they actually signify, just because they're there. Let's put it. Why not?
And it's the Indian consumer's subjectivity is that like there is even Amazon had this campaign called Aur Dikhao. Basically, it's like ye bhi do, wo bhi do. It's like this Indian thali metaphor. Like they want a little bit of everything on the same garment. So it's like the whatever brand value of Nike and Ferrari on the same product. So it's trying to maximize the bang for the buck kind of a thing. So
right. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I remember that in your article you make a parallel with the work on by François Julien on Chinese pragmatism and the notion of efficacy, right? I was just wondering, it's always kind of like difficult and risky to make parallels between two places that are so different in terms of their history and social hierarchies. So I was just wondering, like, what do you see as the connection there between? I think you talk about like this notion of what was it, like kam chalao, like the efficacy of basically something that just becomes useful or practical, I guess. And from what François Julien talks about Chinese thoughts. So I was just curious about that.
I also, I guess I am someone who is really gets excited about thinking through ideas, but I also know the pitfalls that sometimes you lose out on some of the details. But I guess like Julien for me is, again, he's also criticized a lot, probably more than me, but because he makes this kind of larger, I think Chinese philosophy is also too detailed to bring out a book like that. But then I guess there is still something to really think about, like the situation approach, and this something also happens in the bazaar, like what, as you see the unfurling in front of you, and you do not decide a tactic beforehand, but it emerges from what's going on. And that's also something, the pragmatism of Chinese philosophy, at least from what I read from Julien, kind of says it to be.
Right.
Yeah. But why not? I mean, long we have done it.
No, I mean, one of the most interesting talks I've heard about brands is like when I was in Japan, and there was the creative director of Muji, and he was trying to explain like how does he think about a brand like Muji, and his whole notion was this notion of emptiness, which he contrasted with you could contrast with a Western notion of what brands are, right? And so at some point, he was kind of like arguing that like brands might function differently, in that particular context, based on a different relationship to narrative and storytelling. And so, and I think what's interesting in the Indian context is that those studies on bazaars, kind of like show that there is something distinctive at play, right? I mean, that's what I find interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Is there another question? No, I think we have answered all questions. I don't know, Rupali, if you want to wrap up or.
I just want to thank every one of you, and I'm so happy. Like, I hope in the future we get to chat more, probably in person, and best wishes. This is really a good space, and hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe, Rupali and, Adishri, I'm working on this project. If there's an opportunity for them to maybe, chat with you at some point, and it'll be interesting also to understand also what you are working on these days. I guess that would be like and how how you do field work now, but it's a little bit more difficult to do field work in India.
Yeah, I am actually also trying to do like more Guwahati and small town. Not Guwahati is not a small town, but it's my hometown. So I'm going to be doing more. Probably
Right.
we'll chat later. Yeah. It's great. Best wishes with all your projects, and look forward to reading and hearing.
Yeah, Rupali, you want to say a few words or?
Yeah, this was a really fascinating conversation. It actually made me think a lot about my own experiences of traversing through a lot of these markets. I have been born and brought up in Delhi. And it also made me suddenly rethink of the ways in which people are thinking of brands, especially when they come as, on these shirts and trousers and all of this. So it's probably a much different interpretation than what we're probably used to. So it was an extremely fascinating, very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking out the time to share your work. We would be really keen to also connect with you, and we would love to tell you a little bit about the project that we're also doing. So yeah, I'll connect with you over email. I don't know if Adishri also wants to add something.
I mean, for me, it was really interesting because I'm from Kolkata, and in Kolkata, we have this one place called Fancy Market, which is like the hub of your counterfeited products. And I remember I went back to, the times when I used to go there, and you find a lot of these traders making their own little innovations over there. And, I just kind of recalled one such conversation I had with one of the guys where they say that, we do a little things, but there is no recognition for what we do. And there is also this fear that, we might be displaced at any point. So, there is this need for some kind of a legal, tangible recognition that these guys are also looking for. And while I was going through your paper this weekend, I found one such quote when you were talking about the knowledge of the Bazaar actors. And that is something that I came across and I found really interesting. And this discussion kind of added to that. And it was really, really interesting to kind of, go through the entire paper with your experiences in fieldwork as well. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. And I think this was our last talk and webinar for the year. And hope to connect with you again, Maitrayee. And thanks, Rupali, for organizing this, and Adishri. And I guess maybe it's a good time to say goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining.
Bye.
Thank you.